I think we've all had the experience where you're driving down the highway and you're trying to get into a different lane and the person won't let you into the lane, right? And you just wait and then the person passes and then you try to get into the lane again and the next person won't let you in. And that's just a kind of experience that everyone has. It's a common everyday experience. At the same time, I go to a gym, and at this gym that I go to, whenever I go there, there's always someone, whenever someone's ahead of you, they always hold the door for you. And so the natural thing is that when I have the door, I hold the door for the next person, and it goes on and on. So we see these two real tendencies in human nature, right? One is a tendency towards selfishness, towards saying me first, right? It's all about getting my way, and it's my way and not another person's way. Other people are obstacles that I have to overcome in order to get what I want, right? But there's another aspect of human nature, which is also grounded in human nature, which is cooperation, right? Where we seek to work together, where we see our interests as deeply enmeshed with other people's interests. And when other people are doing well, we feel that we're doing well. And we open in generosity and care and compassion to other people. And so, both these elements are linked to our survival, both the selfish element as well as this expansive and connected element. And I would call these two different mindsets, really, a contracted mindset on the one hand, where you see yourself as very small and atomized and opposed to others, versus an expansive mindset. Now, Jewish tradition recognizes this, and they actually recognize these two mindsets, and they give different terms to this. They call it, on the one hand, they call the contracted mindset the evil inclination, and they call the expansive mindset the good inclination. And so when we're coming to the question of, well, what is the source of evil, right? At some level, this is part of the answer, right? When we're very selfish, when we're very concerned just about ourselves, right? When we see it, if someone else gets something, that's taking it from me. I have to get it from the other person before they take it from me. When we see life as a zero-sum game, that causes a lot of violence. That causes a lot of disruption between people. While when we're generous and connected, that is a kind of condition for peace. But I think actually, there are certain situations where there's kind of war of all against all, where you're just everyone's going for the same thing, and there's kind of chaos. And that happens, and that's a kind of source of evil. But there's also, I think the deeper source is actually when these two get connected, right? And when on the one hand, you feel connected to other people, you feel a sense of affiliation with other people, but you form a group, and that group is opposed to other groups, right? And it's a kind of death struggle between the two groups, right? And the good for your group depends on the other group failing, and the other group thinks that their goodness depends on you failing. So it's almost like a social Darwinism, right? And I think that's a kind of a really much more profound and much more troubling source of evil. So what's the attraction to these two different modes of being, right? The contracted mindset and the expansive mindset. Well, one thing that's attractive about the contracted mindset is that we feel powerful. When we're angry, when we feel hate, we get a jolt of energy. We feel like alive, right? Some people are enjoying their anger in the sense that they feel like energized by it, right? But in a really deeper sense, the true power really comes from being able to connect, right? And that's what's kind of helped us as a species. That's what's really allowed us to really flourish as a species, and is this ability to connect and see our interests as entwined with other people. Now, one of my favorite philosophers and Jewish philosophers in the Jewish tradition is Moses Mendelssohn. And he was someone who lived in the Enlightenment in the 18th century, and he faced a lot of discrimination, and there was a lot of hatred towards him. But he recognized this point that the greatest power is in reconciliation. He commented on the story of God's revelation to Moses in Exodus 34. Moses asked God to show me your face, and God reveals his face, and what is it? God reveals his mercy, 13 attributes of mercy, That's God's greatest power, not the fear, not the terror, the mercy. And Moses Mendelssohn says, it requires some reflection if we are to comprehend that hatred and vindictiveness, envy and cruelty are at bottom nothing but weakness and merely the effects of fear. Fear combined with accidental, uncertain superiority is the mother of these barbaric sentiments. Fear alone renders us cruel and implacable. He who is conscious with certain of his superiority finds far much greater felicity in indulgence and pardon. So when we feel secure, we feel much more prone to conciliation. It's when we're fearful and we feel weak that we lash out and we focus on me, my. So I just want to end by thinking about how do we get to move from a contracted to more an expansive mindset. And on the one hand, the very common answer is you have to supply people with material goods, right? If people don't have enough to eat, if they don't have safety, right, they're naturally going to become selfish. They're naturally going to be fearful. They're naturally just going to think about themselves. Well, if they have a lot, if they have abundance, then they could be more open and generous. And there's clearly truth to that. But at the same time, there's many people who are very wealthy who are very selfish and who do some really terrible things. And you have people who are poor and don't have a lot and really open their hearts. So what I'd kind of like to conclude here is that in addition to the material elements of things, the way we come to these different mindsets, contracted versus expansive, has to do with modeling, right? We're naturally imitative beings. We imitate what people do around us, right? If we see people acting selfish, we say, oh, that's the game. The game is selfishness, so let me just get mine. If we see people acting generous, if we see people acting open-hearted, then that rubs off on other people. And we say, oh, we switch to the other mindset. And we say, okay, no, this is a context where I'm open-hearted, where I'm connected. So I think in this world, it can seem like a very scary world where it seems like we have so little power. There's forces, government forces, political forces that are so beyond us that we can't really make any impact. But I would really urge you to consider that all of your actions, whatever you do in the world, if you're generous and open-hearted, that's having an impact on people. And you really have the ability to impact people in little ways and to really kind of change and flip how other people will act. And it will ripple out for a good effect. So.
Thank you. So in some ways, my comments are going to be, and we didn't plan it that way, but this is how how it's turning out. My comments are going to be a long footnote on a small comment by Mendelssohn about superiority that has been made, and kind of significance of what we'd often don't recognize as a source of ill, and indeed we often think of it as a source of good, especially kind of cultural and public good. We think that striving for superiority, and by striving for superiority, I mean striving to be better than somebody else, not striving to be better. I would call that striving for excellence, and I would want to categorically distinguish between these two. But striving for superiority, I want to highlight the degree to which this is a kind of a problematic sentiment, and its problematic nature kind of spans from relatively innocent kinds of competitions that occur and senses of inferiority that it leaves us with, to being utterly devastating for the relationship, for the economic life, for political life, and so on. That has been recognized over the centuries. I was doing a little bit of research on that in Rousseau in his Second Discourse. That's a very important kind of problem, and at the origin of sources of inequality. The same is true also of Theory of Moral Sentiments by Adam Smith. But what I like to do is I like to kind of give you a few thoughts based on John Milton's Paradise Lost. Paradise Lost, I hope you have read Paradise Lost. It's not easy reading, but it's a fantastically rewarding text. And talking about politics, this whole Paradise Lost, you can read it as a political tract, his anti-monarchical kind of a stance. But central to the whole story is actually relationship between God and Satan. At least that's how I read that text. Not everybody does. And very early on, actually not very early on in the text, but in the story, very early on, you come to what has been known in Milton studies, Satan's soliloquy. He's talking to himself, and he's right now standing before the entrance into the paradise with a goal to spoil that new creation of God. Those of you who read Paradise Lost will know. And as he's standing there looking the new earth that God has created, and Milton says, with all the delights around him, he was undelighted. And that already indicates to you what happens with the striving for superiority. You cannot delight in the delight if the delight is not indexed positively to your superiority. If it's indexed to somebody else's superiority, suddenly what is a source of delight ends up being a source of envy, in fact, right? So, when he's in this situation, Satan, he then starts thinking about what has brought him there to wage the war against God, to involve this insane insurrection, and then he thinks about he was in a position next to God in the hierarchy of heaven. And then there was a longing that has gripped him, and Milton wisely does not tell us why this longing was there, suggesting in some ways that the kind of the problem of the emergence of evil. We can see the mechanism that pushed you there, but why you make the decision that you make remains hidden in mystery. I personally think, people would disagree with that in terms of our life in the world, we are faced with two great mysteries. One is the mystery of love, and the other one is the mystery of evil. And both of these mysteries are not quite accessible to explanation, to reason, of reason. And in some ways, for us to recognize them as what we intuitively think they are, they need to remain shrouded in mystery. That may be also the question that we might discuss. Is there something like mystery of evil, or is it kind of rationally discernible and identifiable what is the source of evil? But it's no accident that it's the second in line that is experiencing this sense of needing to be the second. The worst thing is, right, in Olympic Games, where you have when you have people getting medals, second place is terrible, right? They didn't make the first, right? The third place is great. I'm standing on the podium, but second place is often a very difficult spot to be. That's where Satan is, second place, and there is a sense of inferiority, that causes him to go into the rebellion mode, and suddenly this inability to live it himself. He wants to make one step that will make him highest, jump over God into the highest position, which in and of itself is a kind of desire that he knows is unbounded and unreasonable. And nonetheless, that sense of self-loathing in comparison with others drives him, and he cannot free himself from it. Interesting thing to read is kind of the pain of Satan at not being able to free himself of it. And that's also an indicator, I think, to me about the character of evil. Often we think the evildoers are they just do it because they do it as a kind of high action of the will, and fail to see the captivity that lies behind that, a captivity to the power of evil. And of course, when Satan cannot help himself, he wages war against God. He knows it's completely futile. He develops the whole theology and ontology of how he came to be so that he wouldn't be dependent on God. So you have evil creating ideologies for itself in which it can live relatively comfortably and masking, in fact, who the person is, so as to be able to live a life as they wish to live. And if you look at the temptation that he then exposes Adam and Eve in Milton's reading of this, he basically wants to create Eve in his own image, because that's going to spoil the new creation that God has made. So my sense is that in our lives, often kind of this striving for superiority, the problem of evil often lies in this striving for superiority. And I will end with its relationship to friendship. And this is a story from the Bible. Some of you will be familiar. I'm going to exposit it, notwithstanding it's from the Hebrew Bible. I'm going to briefly exposit it, and then Micah will correct me. And that's, as you can anticipate, story of Cain and Abel, which I read as a story. You can read it various ways, obviously, which I read as a story of the problematic nature of wanting, not striving to become superior, but by all means wanting to protect one's own superiority. Cain is the firstborn. Already it's signaled kind of certain kind of importance, and then Eve gives him that name, which means, with the help of God, I have given birth to a human child. Right. So this a proud mother is elevating her own son. Second is born, which is Abel, and Abel means kind of vapor, kind of vanity, almost like nothingness. And so you have already in the two names a kind of profound difference inscribed, and Cain takes over what has been projected unto him as a firstborn, and sees himself as important, and Abel is nothing, not nothing in absolute sense, but nothing in comparison with, which is fundamental in this. And then they both offer a sacrifice to God, and then miracle of miracle happens that crosses the entire world of Cain. Namely, God looks with favor on Abel's sacrifice, but not on Cain's. Now we can guess why. We can try to guess why that happened, but for a moment we can leave it as it is. The sheer fact of a sacrifice being recognized of Abel by the highest authority, no less, right, was enough to place Cain in the position of rage, and therefore to motivate the first murder that one has recorded in the Bible. Again, now striving not to become superior, but striving to retain the status of superiority creates, is at the core of the evil that's being perpetrated between two who are brothers, two who are in fact friends. And maybe in this dynamic there's also a little bit of hope, that is to say, of possibility of ways in which we can cross the push toward superiority. And maybe we can talk about that if you are interested in the remainder of this evening. Thank you.
Thank you to both of you for that. That was really inspiring and very informative, and kind of like a follow-up question, as you both kind of already touched on this idea of the goodness and the evilness. So my question is to ask about, how would you define human nature with that balance, and also how do you see human nature's role in conflict?
Yeah, I very much agree what Michah said about there are the two principles, if you want. They're kind of two sides of us. I suppose what I would want to add, and I don't think there will be disagreement, I would want to say that human goodness is more fundamental than the human evil or the evil principle. It's so that the evil that qualifies our acts, and sometimes, and we can talk about whether evil qualifies the person or just the acts of a person. What is the relationship between evil deeds and the character of the person who is committing those deeds? But I would say that that evil acts are always the spoiling off, diversion from, alternative to the more fundamental good. And I personally root that in the fact that it was the good God who created the world, and therefore there's a goodness of the creation as a whole, and there's also goodness of human beings as those who live in that, as a part of that world. I think that should suffice.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I would agree with that. I would again go back to kind of what I had been speaking about earlier, which a lot of it was about human nature and the fact that we have this basic drive for us to survive. Right? There's this basically survival instinct, and part of that survival instinct is connected with the desire for power, right? And this is something, an important teaching Spinoza teaches, that we're all seeking to increase our power because our power is going to help us survive, right? And that can kind of manifest itself if we see ourselves in a very small way in terms of, okay, how do I get more for myself, right? There's that basic instinct drive for myself to survive, and to hell with everyone else. And I think when that gets out of whack, that kind of selfishness is really evil. But at the same time, not just human beings, but other species also have this impetus also to collaborate. But in fact, as human beings, that's our great power, right? That's how did we become such a dominant species, was from our ability to collaborate not just among 10 or 100 or 1,000, but with hundreds of thousands, millions of people, through language, through religion, right? Through common ideas, common principles and myths and history. And when we expand that out, in an extremely inclusive way, then that kind of brings us to real goodness. But again, I think the danger is when it becomes very tribal, and there's a good impetus in trying to connect others, but when we limit that and then go back into that selfish, either it's me or you, zero-sum game, I think that's danger. And that's, in fact, a source of much less power. That the more we're connected to other people, the more people we're connected in a true way, in a deep way, in a loving way, the more we see ourselves, our good in other people's goods, the more powerful we are. Right? And what is the ultimate power? Well, God's infinite power. God's inclusive of everything. And when we come to see ourselves as also inclusive of everything, we greatly expand in our power. And that's where you could say it's more fundamental, or the power of love is much greater than the power of hate and division.
Would you also say that that the search for survival as such is a search for good?
Yeah.
And if it's exclusively oriented I against you and you against me, then it's kind of a twisted. If it simply is growth in my power at the expense of yours, then it's a twisting of something good, which is to say my own care for myself as an agent, as an entity that has been created by a good God.
Yeah, 100%. And I don't think people, and again, this is kind of more coming from my understanding of the Jewish tradition, I don't think some people are kind of irredeemably evil. I think the evil is coming from a good impulse to grow, to sustain myself. But when it's seen when I misapprehend what my true good involves, and I see it in this very limited way, that's where I end up having problems.
Can I ask you another question?
Sure.
Am I interrupting? Because you have invoked Spinoza and this increase in power, not simply survival, but more that obviously Nietzsche has taken it almost directly from Spinoza and placed it in a very different context. That for him becomes the overarching moral value that moral maybe under quotation, that organizes the entirety of the revaluation of values that he undertakes. And so how would you describe what the difference between Spinoza's emphasis on increasing of powers and this Nietzschean?
Yeah, well, I think Nietzsche often, at least has been interpreted, whether this is actually what he meant is always a question, but in terms of seeing power often in terms of domination, domination over others. And I think what Spinoza is trying to say is that you can understand a kind of very traditional religious discourse about morality, about goodness, about generosity, about care for the, care for others in terms of power. Because when I'm only thinking about myself, or I'm trying to dominate someone else, that represents fear. That represents a lack of power. That's a kind of overcompensation. Whereas when I'm really able to open to someone, and I have the security to open to someone and then to connect to someone, that's the greatest source of power. Really being able to have that, open-heartedness and the security to be able to do that, I think is, Spinoza sees that as the greatest expression of power.
So I think it's regulated by power is regulated by something, right? Whereas for Nietzsche, power regulates. For Spinoza, power is regulated by being inserted into larger concern for the larger good.
Yeah, and being embedded in nature and being in part of this totality of nature, which is God.
Yeah.
And
okay, I can go to my next question. I'm really glad to see that you guys are agreeing on a lot, but I also want to recognize that we're in a multi-faith space, and my next question really centers on that. So how can religious views that are irreconcilable with one another, that turn to conflict, be navigated in multi-faith friendships?
Yeah, so I could start with that. And again, I'm very hesitant to speak for a religious tradition because, I'm a scholar and there's religious traditions say so many different things, and you could pick out so many different things from different religious traditions. And so I kind of speak from my understanding of Judaism, that goes without saying, and from the people that I really revere within Judaism, people like the philosopher Moses Maimonides and the philosopher Moses Mendelssohn. These are the ones who are kind of my guiding lights. But there is a very important tradition within Judaism that goes back to the rabbinic period, which is the idea that you don't have to be Jewish in order to attain salvation. Right? This is the idea of that if anyone, that Jews are given laws, 613 laws according to the tradition, but there's these 7 laws which if anyone follows these laws, then they also attain salvation. And these laws, as they're understood by Moses Mendelssohn, are essentially laws of nature in terms of laws of they're moral laws of nature, right? They're kind of universal laws of moral nature. And if anyone follows that, then they go to heaven, because Moses Mendelssohn says God is a God of love. And what does God really want? At bottom, God wants us to express that love to other people. So in 1769, Moses Mendelssohn, he was this important figure in the German Enlightenment. He was Jewish, he'd been from a Jewish background, and he came out into the German world of letters. And he kind of came to be very celebrated for his philosophical writings. But a lot of Christians at the time thought, well, how could this Jew be this great philosopher, right? Jews are supposed to be very backward. Jews are supposed to be very, blind. They're blind to the truth of Christianity. And how could they have produced someone like this? Well, he must not really be a Jew. He must really be a Christian at heart. So they challenged him to convert. This person named Lavater challenged him to either refute Christianity or convert. And his idea, again, going back to what we were talking earlier, is that religion is a zero-sum game, right? Either it's Judaism or Christianity. They both can't be true. Either you refute Christianity or you reject Judaism. And Mendelssohn was in a difficult situation because he was a minority, and it was very dangerous to criticize Christianity at that time. But he wrote this kind of very masterful letter back to Lavater. And I'll quote one of his lines, one of my favorite lines from it. Mendelssohn says, "I am lucky to be friends with many an excellent man who is not of my faith. We sincerely love one another, even though we suspect and suppose that we are of entirely different opinions in matters of faith. I enjoy the pleasure of their company, which improves and delights me. Never did my heart secretly call out to me, 'Too bad about their beautiful souls.'" And he says, "Whoever guides people to virtue in this life cannot be damned in the next one." Right? So if a person is living an ethical life, I may have a sincere disagreement about them in matters of faith. He thinks different traditions have different ways of understanding things. They're historical traditions. They speak to people in different ways. That's perfectly fine. If a person lives this life of compassion, care for other people, how could God possibly condemn them to eternal suffering? He says that just doesn't make sense. That doesn't conform with my idea or what he thinks is the Jewish idea of God.
Yeah, that's a line. If I heard it rightly, he says when we suspect that they differ radically, something. How does the line go?
Even though we suspect and suppose that we are of
I love that. Even though we suspect and suppose, and I'd want to question this, right? In a sense, take the little opening that is left there, and say that. It would seem to me that certainly it's the case for Christianity and Judaism. I think it's the case for these two religious traditions and Islam. It's also true of other tradition that there is a great deal of overlap in the fundamental convictions. Just ask Nietzsche. He will tell you. He can from his vantage point. If you look at these traditions, there are internal differences, but on the whole, there is a great deal of agreement. And I think that sometimes when we encounter each other, we major on differences, and I'm not the one to say that there aren't any differences, but it seems to me in terms of possibilities of life, possibilities, say, of political life, and possibilities of friendship, that differences are such that we can easily, and as a matter of fact, in many cases, easily live with them and around them without needing to give up on a particular form of faith that I embrace. I certainly have friends who are Christians with whom I differ more than some of my friends who are Jewish or who are Muslim. So the Christianness or as such isn't a decisive category. It certainly used to be in the 17th century, or even maybe 40 years ago. But I don't think it is now anymore, and I think we have good reasons to emphasize the wide level of agreement and therefore be able to live very well if we are sincere, if we don't see our communities as political blocs, interest groups, but see ourselves as moral communities. And as moral communities, I think we can live very well together without deep conflicts.
Can I just say one thing? Because part of what, again, Moses Mendelssohn famously says, when he says at the end of his book, is, part of the greatest expression of love and compassion is being able to respect that someone has a different point of view. And, this kind of respect and this idea that we can have different approaches, and that's perfectly fine. And we don't have to agree on everything, certainly not on theological matters. But that ultimately, if we're able to have this, again, as you're saying, this common moral foundation, then and this common respect and love for others, then again, it's the greatest expression is not to make us have to conform to one another's opinions, but to be able to appreciate the differences between us and based on history and tradition and just conviction.
Yeah, those have been great answers. We're super thankful again that you both are here having this conversation with us. I think just like one final follow-up, even on this conversation that we're having, are as we attempt to reach reconciliation and conflict, whether it be interreligious or not, what are some resources that faith has to offer to help us approach these issues, whether it be with other people who may have religious convictions or even those who may not? What ways have you all found helpful, or what resources have you found helpful? Whoever would like to
Well, okay, I'll start. You can. So to me, one of the most significant Christian convictions is that each human being has been created in God's image. That confers a kind of dignity to the sheer humanity and grounds, I think for me, human rights. And it's not easy to offer grounding of human rights. Here I follow my erstwhile colleague, who's now emeritus, Nicholas Wolterstorff, who in his book Justice, Rights and Wrongs has a whole chapter devoted to how we can ground human rights, and he thinks that you have to have some kind of a theistic grounding of them. Otherwise, you cannot ground rights of humans qua humans. You always have to tie to certain kind of qualities that they possess, but not tied to them as humans. To me, that's one of the really very important insights. Consequence of that, I think, is also that we are called to honor each person. There is a sense in which each person deserves from us equal honor in the virtue of their humanity. That to me is a great motivation for, and not just motivation, but also substantive contribution to overcoming difficulties, which in practical life it means no matter what you do and who you are, I have to honor the humanity in you, therefore treat you in a particular kind of a way. And that already, I think, has built in itself a modes of relating to others that simply cannot dismiss what they say, dismiss what they think, let alone simply look at them and dismiss them simply because they belong to a different group that oneself belongs. Add to this the command of love, and I think and think of this command of love in the way in which Jesus practiced it. And I think one of the signature rites that Christians have completely forgotten, which I think is amazing, is the so-called foot washing. Are you familiar with that? You know what happens just before Jesus was crucified, he is with his disciples, and then he takes the apron and starts washing their feet, each one of his disciples. And in the Jewish tradition of the time, even slave was not allowed to be forced to do that. So he uses, he takes this moment of their departure to kind of symbolically represent the way in which they are encouraged to, commanded indeed, to act toward each other. Commanded not necessarily to wash the feet, but to enact what this symbolically enacts, to act in this way. Now, to me, that's, I think I should be able to live in peace with people of any faith with these kinds of conviction if I take them seriously.
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is, when we think about being loving and having a loving heart, where do we get that? Well, the first place we get that is from our family, right? If you feel this kind of love from your parents, and you feel this kind of real unconditional love from your parents, you learn that. And then when you're a parent, you take that to your children. We're always, this modeling is very critical. And I think what a very central element of Judaism is the idea that Judaism is a religion, but it's also a family, right? And the idea is that your love and your concern doesn't just stop at your family, your nuclear family, or your grandparents, or your cousins, but it extends beyond that to, a whole, millions of people, right? And that's a kind of lesson that you learn in terms of care and concern. And I think that, the challenge but the great opportunity really is that it doesn't stop there. It's from that learning to be in connection with this greater family that goes well beyond your parents, your grandparents, your cousins, and encompasses all these people you never know. You've never known, you've never met before. You can learn from that to ultimately spread that to the whole world, to all of humanity. And this is like, love is something, because love is really a skill. It's not something we're just necessarily born automatically loving. We have to really cultivate that. And the more support we have for that, the better. And I think Judaism does, at its best, really provide that.
Wow, that's beautiful. I'm speechless. I think that both of you provided such wonderful answers to that question. I guess just as a follow-up, what are even ways that both of you have seen this love cultivated within different communities, even outside of your family or outside of religious communities?
I mean, I can say, in our synagogue, they, have, established these little task force to help people. For instance, there were Afghan refugees that have been coming, and there's these task force in the synagogue that have been set up to help welcome the people and settle them and drive them around to appointments. And obviously these people are not members of the Jewish community, but the idea is that the same love and concern that we do express for people within the community should be expressed now should be expressed for everyone. And that's just kind of one example of many of these projects that are constantly going on in the synagogue that I'm privileged to be a part of, that are very inspiring and really kind of pushing one to move oneself out of one's little space into a concern for everyone.
Yes, there's so many examples, and I'm always struck. Sometimes one might think, if one is a religious person, one might look only for examples in one's own community. We're all inclined to do that, and there are wonderful examples. I'm also struck how many examples there are of people of no faith, or faith that is very different than mine, faith that is proximate to mine, who do these extraordinary acts of and not just kind of help, but there's one thing is to just help somebody. And the thing is to help with kind of attending and honoring and kind of emotional investment to help another person. Jesus tells a story about this one widow. Jesus was doing this nasty thing, watching how people put the money in the temple treasury. You shouldn't be doing that, Jesus. I mean, but he wasn't trained very well. So he observed what was happening, and then he sees people with the great display of piety drop great amounts of money, and then there's this one widow who gives 2 pennies, and what she gives is the last thing that she has had. And Jesus said, she has given the most. Right? Now, you can think of it as most proportionately to what she had, right? She gave everything, and therefore she gave most. But you can also see in that gift not just the importance is not just the effect of that gift on somebody else, But the importance of the gift is with what kind of stance, inward stance, that gift is given. And to me, that was such a wonderful example, because very often when we help other people, we kind of flout our own superiority toward them. We drop that money and we make sure that everybody knows that it has happened. And yet, that there is a kind of almost like an inner distance from the person and concern for one's own reputational standing. But you've got the stories of giving sometimes that are just such as this woman of whom Jesus speaks, namely where the soul is involved in the giving, and that beautifies the person who received and beautifies also the person who gives. And I see that also, certainly not just in Christian faith. To the contrary, I'm sometimes impressed how lousy we are, but I see it in many situations and celebrate it wherever I see it.
The first question that we have for the two of you is, how do we forgive the seemingly unforgivable? How do we sacrificially love those who have expressed no desire to reconcile during these times of conflict?
Yeah. Yeah, easy. It's a really the kind of the question of how do we forgive unforgivable is also the question of kind of moral substance, which is really important to discern well. Is there such thing as unforgivable, or do we mean something that feels as if it were unforgivable? The other question, how do we love, is a question of motivation. It seems that they should be loved. The question then becomes, what does that love entail? And how do I get motivated to love? That has been accompanied when I wrote this book, Exclusion and Embrace. One of the central questions of the book that remained in the book unaddressed, central unaddressed questions in the book is, I emphasize the will to embrace. That is to say, to want to reconcile. But what remained unaddressed in the book is, how does one generate the will? How does one motivate the will so that one, in fact, wants to do what one feels that ought to be, what one believes ought to be done. I mean, I can simply say for me as a Christian, and this is my family story, there's a case of forgiveness in my family that defined the entire family life when my 5-year-old brother was killed by negligence of a soldier. And both of my parents independently quoted the same Bible verse, "Forgive as you have been forgiven in Christ." And that was for them kind of a decision. That's what the Bible says. We'll do that. Now, the difficulty was, how does one actually do it? And so one of the most difficult things my mother told me that she has ever done, to try to forgive. So, but it was also something she felt, not only that she had some kind of duty imposed on her by finger-wagging God or something like that. It was something that she felt ought to qualify, characterize her own humanity. So in a sense, she was trying to live into the self that she aspired to become. And it's a spiritual struggle for which I think one has to be prepared by shaping the soul before the critical moment often comes. And just maybe a quick note on forgivable and unforgivable sins. I'm committed to there not being any unforgivable sins. But that's a very difficult position to hold, because there are atrocious, absolutely atrocious acts. And that's partly tied with the way in which I think about forgiveness. Some people think of forgiveness kind of outside of the concerns of justice. And I don't. The naming the wrong as wrong, identifying it as wrong without qualification is, in my understanding of forgiveness, fundamental for the act of forgiveness. So the right remembering and right naming is what makes, of right naming of the wrongdoing as what kind of wrongdoing it is essential to the act of forgiveness. And then on the other end, I think something like a restoration on the part of the one who has wronged is absolutely essential to forgiveness as well. We practice often very cheap forgiveness, which is almost like a little ritual that we go through, and we think that seems almost like a hello, how are you? That's not meant, right? That's meant simply to be hello. So it's also, I kind of ask for forgiveness, you forgive, and nothing has happened except some kind of a niceties that say, well, we'll continue to be nice to each other. But actual forgiveness is much more spiritually demanding and ought to be also practiced as that, and it involves sincere apology, but not just that, an attempt to restore what one has wrongdoing has disturbed. I always like the saying by Desmond Tutu, you can ask me to forgive you for stealing my bicycle, but if you continue riding my bicycle, how can I can forgive you, but that means nothing.
Yeah, I mean, you said so much there, and there's, this is such a difficult topic, but when someone has really truly harmed you, what does it mean to have love for that person? I mean, I was talking to a friend of mine, and we were discussing this, and it's really hard to wish someone well when someone has done real wrong to you, and it's very raw. I think it's almost like impossible to really feel that. But one thing that I heard, some teachers say is that if someone has done something really wrong from a real kind of place of hatred, you can wish that person be free from their hatred, and I think that there's something as a little bit of a different resonance, but I mean, I think, in practice, these things are so difficult when you've actually, suffered, and it takes a long time to process it, and, especially when it's something very severe. So, I mean, I do believe that in the long term, Spinoza was right, and when he said that, hatred just breeds more hatred, and the only way to overcome that is through love. But how you get there is, can be a real process. A lot of reconciliation has to go on. So,
thank you.
Thank you. There are a lot of questions coming in, so I feel like, to be fair and democratic, I'm going to ask the one with the most votes. So it asks, humanity is inherently good, while what is evil is a deviation from what that good is something I haven't heard before. How do you interpret that with original sin?
I think that's for me. I think that's for me. Well, that's exactly what kind of original sin, and we can have a long discussion of what that exactly means. But somehow it means that we are implicated in the sin of quote unquote first human. That is to say that there is a kind of shared sense of guilt and stain in humanity, and we can, but that's really not the content of the question. So the idea of that is that original sin means not that first there was sin and then there was good. Original sin means that first there was good and then the sin was committed, and that sin was twisting and misusing that good, with mostly a certain kind of maybe wrongly perceived good in view as well. So that even in the sin structure of sin itself, actually the good has predominance. There may be cases, I don't want to argue necessarily against it, there may be cases, but it's very difficult to imagine doing evil just because it's evil. Very few people do that. They do it because they construe what they're doing as a good, and by construing it as a good, they already affirm the good, right? They affirm the wrongly construed good, but nonetheless, in that they're affirming the primacy of the good.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Just one final question to end our night. Are there circumstances in which reconciliation is not advisable, even when there has been forgiveness? If so, maybe an example would be helpful.
Reconciliation where there has been forgiveness.
Yes.
I don't fully so
I guess
people
maybe
have forgiven each other, but they are still not
but
reconciled.
maybe they choose not to, like, you could forgive someone and maybe choose not to then, like, continue to have them in your circle or whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, if someone has been betrayed, I don't think they have an obligation to be friends with the person who betrayed them. They may be able to forgive that person. And at the end of the day, forgiveness is really for yourself at some level, because holding this anger and this resentment is something that can be so corrosive, right? And at the end of the day, just for one's own mental health, one, needs to forgive. But, is there always, going to be a kind of happy ending where everything, well, I don't know if that necessarily is the case, right? Some people, it's too much has been broken, and to really come back to that. You can still, if there's been forgiveness, maybe in some way you can still wish the person well, but they don't have to be a big part of your life anymore.
And some of it is, and I think it was implied in what you said, some of it is because trust has not necessarily been restored by the act of forgiveness. There's a kind of beginnings of that, especially if there is if one can perceive a kind of a sincere remorse and repentance, especially if there is some kind of restitution. There is a kind of the beginnings of recreating a trust. But relationships have to be based on trust. And in that sense, betrayal is very corrosive of the relationship, and any wrongdoing is a form of betrayal of the relationship. And one can then be in a situation where simply trust is not there, or trust is not being established. There's not sufficient foundation for that trust. Or one can simply say, well, right now there is not yet there, but we can build that relationship. And reconciliation hasn't fully yet taken place, but it's on the way. And I sometimes think that even forgiveness ought to be seen as not just a single act, but a kind of process, a practice almost into which one lives. And certainly that's the case with reconciliation. It's the case in reconciliation with somebody you truly love, who's your friend or who's your partner. That often there is reconciliation, but what has happened is somehow hovering here in the background, and you kind of have to patiently work through that because full trust has not yet been established. Something happens, and immediately one is triggered back to what has happened in the past. And that is we just have to not expect too much, or either of forgiveness or reconciliation at any moment, but to be involved in the process and carry on with it to the extent that we think that's a wise decision. Sometimes it simply isn't, and as Michah has pointed out.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
No, I was just going to say thank you both. This was, I know, really informative for everyone in the room. And again, just thank you both for coming and sharing this conversation with us.